I knew the exact sound the heavy iron key made when it turned in the back door lock of the Oak Street diner. It was a solid, metallic clunk that echoed in the dark alleyway at 4 o'clock in the morning. I had turned that key every single day for 12 years. I knew the smell of the kitchen before the ventilation hoods were turned on, a dense, permanent mixture of old coffee, roasted onions, and decades of embedded bacon grease. To some people, it smelled like cheap food and long hours. To me, it smelled like home. It smelled like my family's legacy. My name is Maya. When I was 22 years old, I was halfway through a master's degree in urban planning at the State University. I was fascinated by the way cities breathed, the way traffic patterns dictated human behavior, and the invisible lines of zoning laws that shaped entire economies. I had a clear path forward. But then, my father, Thomas, called me in tears. The diner, which our family had owned since the 1970s, was weeks away from foreclosure. My father was a brilliant, hard-working cook, but he was a catastrophically bad businessman. He trusted the wrong suppliers. He never raised prices to match inflation because he didn't want to upset the regular customers. He had taken out a second mortgage to cover payroll, and the bank had finally lost patience. I didn't hesitate. I packed up my apartment, withdrew from my master's program, and moved back home. I took over the books. I spent my 20s sitting in the tiny windowless office at the back of the kitchen, staring at Excel spreadsheets until my eyes blurred. I negotiated aggressive payment plans with our vendors. I fired the lazy line cooks who were stealing inventory. I audited every single receipt. It was exhausting, brutal, unglamorous work. I smelled constantly of fryer oil. My fingernails were permanently stained with printer, ink, and tomato paste, but I saved it. By my 30th birthday, the Oak Street Diner was not just surviving. It was highly profitable. We paid off the second mortgage. We had a line out the door on Sunday mornings. My father called me his savior. He promised me on multiple occasions that the restaurant would be mine. "You built this, Maya," he would say, wiping his hands on his flour-dusted apron. "This is your future." I believed him. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own career, and my own social life because I believed I was securing my place in our family's empire. I should have paid more attention to my older brother, Leo. Leo was the golden boy. He was 3 years older than me, incredibly charismatic, and entirely allergic to hard work. While I was waking up at 4 in the morning to receive the produce deliveries, Leo was sleeping until noon in his expensive downtown apartment. While I was scrubbing the grease traps, Leo was pitching his 5th failed tech startup to my father, asking for just a little bridge loan to get his ideas off the ground. My father never said no to Leo. He believed the traditional lie that the son was meant to go out and conquer the world, while the daughter was meant to stay home and keep the fires burning. Leo was allowed to take risks because I was there to provide the safety net. Leo's wife, Sarah, was even worse. Sarah came from a wealthy suburban family and spent her days shopping and curating her social media presence. She actively despised the diner. She refused to eat there, calling the food artery-clogging peasant slop. She hated that my hands were calloused. She hated that I drove an old, reliable sedan instead of a leased luxury SUV. "You work too hard, Maya," Sarah would say at Thanksgiving dinners, sipping wine that my diner profits had paid for. "You should really focus on finding a husband before you lose your looks entirely to that greasy kitchen." I usually just bit my tongue. I knew my worth. I knew who held the keys to the kingdom. Then, everything collapsed. It happened on a busy Tuesday afternoon. My father collapsed near the flat-top grill. It was a massive, sudden heart attack. The paramedics arrived within 4 minutes. But there was nothing they could do. He died on the floor of the kitchen he loved so much, surrounded by the smell of roasted onions and the frantic shouts of the waitstaff. The grief shattered me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process the sudden, gaping hole in my life. I organized the funeral. I paid for the casket. I kept the restaurant running through the tears because I knew my father would have wanted the doors open for the morning rush. 2 weeks after the funeral, we gathered in a cold, mahogany-paneled conference room at my father's lawyer's office for the reading of the will. I was exhausted. I was wearing a black sweater, holding a styrofoam cup of terrible office coffee. Leo and Sarah sat across the large wooden table. Sarah was wearing a designer black dress and oversized sunglasses, looking like she was attending a celebrity memorial service. Leo looked somber, but he kept checking his expensive watch. The lawyer, an older man named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat and opened the thick manila folder. He read through the standard legal jargon. He read the distribution of the small life insurance policy. He read the assignment of my father's personal car. And then he read the clause regarding the Oak Street Diner and the commercial property it sat on. I hereby leave the entirety of the business known as the Oak Street Diner, including all physical assets, brand rights, and the deed to the commercial property located at 442 Oak Street, to my son, Leo. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I stopped breathing. The styrofoam cup in my hand crushed slight hot coffee spilling onto my knuckles. I didn't feel the burn. "Wait," I said, my voice cracking. "Wait, read that again. There must be a mistake." Mr. Henderson looked up over his half-moon reading glasses. His expression was full of deep, uncomfortable pity. "There is no mistake, Maya. Your father was very explicit when we drafted this update 6 months ago. But he promised me," I stammered, looking frantically between the lawyer and my brother. "I saved the restaurant. I run the entire operation. Leo has never even worked a cash register." Leo shifted in his leather chair. He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed, but Sarah immediately stepped in, placing a protective hand over his. "Thomas knew what he was doing," Sarah said, her voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "Leo is the man of the family now. He needs a solid foundation to build his legacy." I ignored her. I looked directly at the lawyer. "What did he leave me? What about my 12 years of unpaid overtime? What about the equity I built?" Mr. Henderson looked down at the paper. "Your father left you a cash sum of $20,000, Maya. He included a personal note." The lawyer slid a small, sealed envelope across the table. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely open it. Inside was a piece of standard diner receipt paper. My father's messy, slanted handwriting filled the space. "Maya, my strong girl, you are so capable. You can survive anything the world throws at you. You have a brilliant mind. But Leo struggles. He needs this business to anchor him. He needs the security. I know you will understand. Thank you for taking care of me." I stared at the receipt paper. I was being punished for being competent. I was being penalized for surviving. My father had looked at my 12 years of absolute sacrifice and decided that it was simply my duty, while Leo's consistent failures were rewarded with a multi-million-dollar commercial asset and a highly profitable business. I looked up at Leo. "You knew about this." Leo looked away. "Dad and I talked about it. Look, Maya, nothing has to change. You can stay on as the general manager. I'll even give you a small raise. But I'm the owner now. It's time for the diner to evolve." I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. The grief over my father's death was suddenly violently replaced by a cold, sharp, suffocating rage. I walked out of the lawyer's office without saying a word. The hostile takeover began the very next morning. I arrived at the diner at my usual 4 o'clock. My key didn't work. The locks had been changed. I stood in the dark alleyway, the cold morning air biting through my jacket, staring at the brass deadbolt. 10 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled into the alley. Leo and Sarah stepped out. Leo was holding a shiny new set of keys. "Sorry about the locks, Maya," Leo said, not looking sorry at all. "Sarah and I decided we needed tighter security protocols moving forward." "Let me in," I said, my voice dead and flat. They unlocked the door. I walked into the kitchen. The familiar smell of coffee and grease washed over me. but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a crime scene. Sarah didn't even wait for the sun to come up before she started making changes. She walked through the dining room with a clipboard, making faces at the vinyl booths and the retro checkered floor. "This all has to go," Sarah announced loudly, her heels clicking against the linoleum. "It is entirely too blue-collar. We are going to rebrand. Upscale American Fusion. We'll call it the Copper Spoon Bistro. We need velvet seating. We need a sommelier. We need to triple the menu prices." "You can't do that," I said, stepping out of the kitchen. "Our entire customer base consists of construction workers, local office staff, and college students. They want cheap coffee and huge portions of eggs. If you triple the prices and put velvet booths in here, you will alienate everyone who keeps this place afloat." Sarah turned to me, lowering her sunglasses. "Maya, please don't pretend you understand modern hospitality trends. You've spent a decade smelling like a deep fryer. We want a better class of clientele." By noon, the disaster escalated. Sarah fired Maria. Maria was our head waitress. She had worked at the Oak Street Diner for 15 years. She was a single mother of 3. She knew every regular customer's order by heart. Sarah fired her because Maria didn't fit the upscale aesthetic of the new bistro. I found Maria crying in the employee break room. I stormed into the back office. Leo was sitting in my chair. He was sitting at my desk, looking at the complex Excel spreadsheets I had built, completely confused by the numbers on the screen. "You cannot fire Maria," I demanded, slamming my hands onto the desk. "She is the heart of the front of house. You are destroying the culture of this restaurant in less than 8 hours." Leo leaned back in my chair. He tried to look authoritative, but he just looked like a child wearing his father's suit. "Sarah is the creative director now," Leo said nervously. "She handles personnel. We need staff who can pour expensive wine, Maya. Maria doesn't fit the vision. The vision is going to bankrupt you." I yelled, finally losing control. "You don't know the profit margins. You don't know the supply chain. You are going to ruin everything I built. You didn't build anything." Sarah's voice cut through the air. She walked into the office, standing right behind Leo. She looked at me with absolute disgust. "Thomas built this, and Thomas gave it to Leo. You were just a glorified bookkeeper. And frankly, your negative attitude is toxic to our new brand." Sarah leaned forward, placing her perfectly manicured hands on the desk. "Leo and I discussed it," she said, smiling a thin, terrible smile. "We don't need a general manager who constantly undermines the ownership. Your services are no longer required, Maya. You're fired." I looked at Leo, my own brother. "Are you going to let her do this?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. Leo wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked at his expensive watch. "It's just business, Maya. It's time for you to move on. I'll have accounting mail you your final paycheck." They were kicking me out. They were stealing my 12 years of sweat, my youth, and my legacy. And they were tossing me into the alleyway like expired produce. I didn't fight them. I knew the law. I had no equity on paper. I had no legal standing. I took my $20,000 inheritance check, packed my personal items into a single cardboard box, and walked out the front door of the Oak Street Diner for the last time. I spent the next 2 weeks lying on the floor of my apartment, drowning in a deep, suffocating depression. I felt completely hollowed out. Everything I had worked for was gone. I watched social media from a distance. Sarah was posting relentless updates about the Copper Spoon Bistro. She posted pictures of the new, ridiculously expensive velvet furniture. She posted pictures of the artisanal menu featuring $25 avocado toast. They were bleeding money into renovations, assuming the upscale clientele would magically appear and cover the costs. I needed a job. I needed to pay my rent. I opened my closet and found the cardboard box containing my university documents. I pulled out my unfinished master's degree transcripts and my bachelor's degree in urban planning. It felt like looking at a ghost. It belonged to a younger, more hopeful version of myself. I went online and checked the municipal job boards. The city was hiring entry-level zoning analysts for the Department of City Planning. The pay was incredibly modest, but the benefits were stable. I applied. During the interview, the department head, a stern older woman named Director Vance, asked about the massive gap in my resume. I spent 12 years running the daily operations, logistics, and supply chain management for a high-volume commercial property in the downtown district. I explained smoothly. I know the commercial zoning codes in this city better than most lawyers because I had to navigate them every single day to keep the business compliant. She was impressed. I was hired on the spot. 2 weeks later, I walked into the massive, brutalist concrete building that housed the municipal government. The environment was completely alien to me. There was no smell of hot grease. There was no shouting over the roar of commercial exhaust fans. The planning department was vast, quiet, and aggressively air-conditioned. It was a sea of gray cubicles filled with people staring silently at glowing monitors. It was the quietest place I had ever worked. But as I sat down at my desk and logged into the city's master zoning database, I quickly realized something profound. The people in this silent gray room held more power than any wealthy business owner in the city. They controlled the invisible lines. They controlled the flow of traffic. They controlled where buildings could go, where businesses could operate, and most importantly, how customers could access those businesses. Director Vance assigned me to the Historical Preservation and Traffic Mitigation Desk. My job was to review old municipal maps and identify commercial districts that suffered from vehicle congestion, with the goal of modernizing the streetscapes for pedestrian safety. On my third day, I pulled up the commercial zoning map for District 4. The map appeared on my dual monitors in bright, intersecting lines of neon green, yellow, and red. I zoomed in on the central commercial artery, Oak Street. I stared at the glowing blue rectangle representing 442 Oak Street, the Copper Spoon Bistro. I knew the physical layout of that street intimately. The restaurant did not have a private parking lot. It was built right up to the property line. For 40 years, the diner had relied entirely on the 25 parallel street parking spaces located directly in front of the building. In the restaurant industry, convenience is oxygen. If customers can't park within walking distance, they don't eat. They drive somewhere else. I clicked on the historical overlay for Oak Street. A wave of old data flooded the screen. My eyes scanned the text. I froze. According to a municipal survey conducted in 1985, the 3 commercial buildings directly adjacent to 442 Oak Street were constructed in the late 1890s. They featured original, preserved Victorian brickwork. Under the city charter, Section 14B, any continuous street segment containing 3 or more preserved structures was eligible to be designated as a protected historical plaza. I read the charter again. My heart started beating faster. The rhythm drumming in my ears was not grief. It was the sudden, thrilling pulse of absolute power. If a street was designated as a protected historical plaza, the city was legally required to remove all vehicular access to prevent structural damage from exhaust vibrations. The street would be completely closed to cars. It would become a pedestrian-only walkway. No cars. No street parking. 0 vehicular access within a 4-block radius of the Copper Spoon Bistro. Sarah wanted an upscale clientele. She wanted wealthy people who drove luxury sports cars and wore expensive shoes. Wealthy people in expensive shoes do not walk 4 blocks in the rain to eat $25 avocado toast. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair. The quiet hum of the air conditioning sounded like a choir. I opened a new blank proposal document on my computer. I typed the title, Oak Street Historical Preservation and Pedestrian Safety Initiative. My brother thought he had stolen my future. He thought kicking me out of the kitchen was the end of the game. He didn't realize he had just forced me into the one room in the city that controlled the very ground his restaurant was built on. I cracked my knuckles, and I began to write. The machinery of municipal government is notoriously slow. It is designed to be inefficient. It is built on endless committees, public hearings, and mountains of redundant paperwork. Most people find the bureaucracy infuriating. They hate the waiting. They hate the red tape. But I didn't hate it. I loved it. Because when you understand how to navigate the red tape, it stops being a barrier and becomes a weapon. A very quiet, very legal, entirely untouchable weapon. The first step in my plan was the Historical Preservation Board. The board consisted of 7 people, mostly wealthy retirees and local academics, who were fiercely protective of the city's architectural heritage. They met on the 3rd floor of City Hall every other Tuesday. They were used to fighting developers who wanted to tear down old brick buildings to build modern glass condos. They were not used to someone inside the planning department handing them a massive victory on a silver platter. I walked into their Tuesday meeting carrying a thick binder filled with old photographs, architectural surveys, and traffic density reports. I presented the Oak Street Pedestrian Safety Initiative. I did not mention my brother. I did not mention the restaurant. I framed the entire project around the preservation of the 1890s Victorian brickwork on the adjacent buildings. The current vehicular traffic on Oak Street is generating subsurface vibrations that are actively degrading the mortar of these historical structures. I explained to the board, projecting a slide showing microscopic cracks in a brick wall. It was technically true. Heavy trucks do cause vibrations. Furthermore, the street parking creates a visual barrier that distracts from the historical aesthetic of the district. If we rezone this 4-block radius as a pedestrian-only plaza, we can install cobblestone walkways, vintage street lamps, and protect the architectural integrity of our city's history for future generations. The board was mesmerized. The chairperson, a woman named Mrs. Higgins, who wore a tweed jacket and round glasses, practically had tears in her eyes. "This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking preservation this city desperately needs," she said, tapping her pen on the table. "I have always hated those ugly parking meters, blocking the view of the Victorian cornices." The board voted unanimously to endorse my proposal. With their powerful backing, the initiative skipped the standard 3-month environmental review queue and was fast-tracked directly to the city council. While I was quietly moving legislative mountains inside the concrete walls of City Hall, Leo and Sarah were actively building their own financial guillotine. Through my old contacts with the restaurant vendors, I heard about the staggering amount of money they were spending. Sarah had completely taken over the project management. She had 0 experience in the hospitality industry, but she had a Pinterest board full of expensive ideas. She wasn't just remodeling the Oak Street diner. She was gutting it to the studs. They took out a massive small business administration loan. To secure the funding, Leo had to use the commercial property, the building my father had painstakingly paid off over 30 years, as collateral. I heard the loan was for $400,000. $400,000. It was a terrifying amount of debt for an independent restaurant. I watched their progress through Sarah's relentless social media updates. She documented every single expensive decision, flying to Italy today to personally select the Carrara marble for the new bar top, she posted one morning, alongside a picture of her drinking a mimosa in a first-class airport lounge. A week later, she posted a video of contractors installing custom-built, imported crystal chandeliers in the main dining room. "The Copper Spoon Bistro is going to redefine luxury dining in this city," the caption read. I sat at my desk, eating a cheap sandwich from the cafeteria, and watched the video. I looked at the massive chandeliers. I looked at the heavy marble bar. Sarah was building a restaurant designed exclusively for the ultra-wealthy. She was targeting a demographic of people who expected valet parking, who wore expensive shoes, and who refused to walk more than 50 feet from their luxury vehicles to the front door. She was building a business model that relied entirely, absolutely, 100% on the convenience of street access, and I was about to erase the street. The final hurdle for my initiative was the public notification period. By law, the city is required to notify all affected property owners within a rezoning district before the city council votes on the measure. This is the moment where business owners usually panic, hire lawyers, and show up to council meetings to protest. This is the moment my plan could have been exposed and halted. But I knew my brother. Leo was a man who couldn't even read a basic profit and loss spreadsheet without getting a headache. He hated paperwork. When he received official-looking mail, he usually threw it in a drawer and ignored it until the final notice arrived. I drafted the notification letter myself. I made sure it was perfectly legal, entirely accurate, and compliant with every single municipal statute. And I made sure it was the most boring, impenetrable wall of bureaucratic jargon ever printed on city letterhead. I titled the document, Notice of Proposed Traffic Calming Measure and Section 14B Historical Overlay District Modification. Regarding non-vehicular arterial flow, I did not use the words street closure. I did not use the words no parking. I buried the actual impact of the rezoning in a dense, 3-page paragraph on the second page, referencing specific subclauses of the municipal code regarding pedestrian transit corridors. The letters were mailed out via certified post. 2 days later, I checked the postal tracking system. The letter for 442 Oak Street had been signed for by Leo. I held my breath for the next 2 weeks. I waited for the phone call. I waited for Leo to burst into City Hall with his lawyer. I waited for Sarah to launch a frantic social media campaign about the government destroying her business. Nothing happened. Leo had opened the letter, read the title about traffic calming measures, assumed it was a notice about a new stop sign or a pothole repair, and threw it in the trash. He was too busy arguing with contractors about the installation of his Italian marble to care about municipal zoning codes. He didn't read the fine print. Just like he didn't read the fine print when he stole my restaurant. The city council vote happened on a rainy Thursday evening. I sat in the back row of the massive, wood-paneled council chambers. The Oak Street Pedestrian Plaza was item number 14 on the agenda. It was bundled with a dozen other minor zoning updates. The council members were tired. They wanted to go home. The mayor, a man who loved anything that made the city look progressive and environmentally friendly, championed the initiative. This plaza will reduce our carbon footprint, protect our historical architecture, and create a beautiful, safe walking space for our citizens, he declared into the microphone. All those in favor, the council president asked. A chorus of A's echoed through the chamber. Opposed? Silence. Motion carries. The Oak Street Historical Pedestrian Plaza is officially approved for immediate implementation. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just quietly packed up my notebook, walked out of the chambers, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. As I started my car, I let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had been sitting in my chest for 6 months finally released. The trap was closed. It was a matter of public record. It was legally binding. There was absolutely nothing Leo or Sarah could do to stop it. The city moved with surprising speed when it came to infrastructure projects that the mayor personally endorsed. I coordinated directly with the Department of Transportation. I managed the construction schedule. I set the start date for the street closure. I chose the date very, very carefully. Sarah had been heavily advertising the grand opening of the Copper Spoon Bistro. She had spent thousands of dollars on targeted social media ads. She had hired a local PR firm. She had invited food critics, local influencers, and wealthy socialites. The grand opening was scheduled for a Friday night in late May. I scheduled the Department of Transportation to begin the street demolition on the Monday of that exact same week. On Monday morning, at 6 o'clock, I drove to Oak Street. I parked my car in a municipal garage a few blocks up away and walked to the corner. I stood under the awning of a closed bakery, holding a cup of hot coffee, and watched the show begin. It was beautiful. 3 massive yellow municipal dump trucks rolled onto Oak Street, followed by 2 front-end loaders and a crew of 20 men in high-visibility vests. The foreman blew a loud air horn. The crew immediately went to work. First, they installed the permanent concrete barricades at both ends of the 4-block radius. These were not temporary plastic cones. They were heavy, reinforced concrete planters designed to stop a moving truck. They completely blocked the intersection. No vehicle could enter. Next, a team of workers moved down the sidewalk with heavy power tools. They unbolted every single parking meter on the street. They ripped them out of the concrete and tossed them into the back of a truck. The 25 parking spaces directly in front of the Copper Spoon Bistro officially ceased to exist. Then came the jackhammers. The noise was deafening. The machines bit into the old asphalt, tearing up the street to prepare the ground for the new cobblestone pedestrian walkways. Dust filled the air. At 7:30, a black luxury SUV pulled up to the concrete barricades at the end of the street. It stopped. It honked its horn. I recognized the license plate. It was Sarah. I watched her step out of the vehicle. She was wearing a beige trench coat and designer sunglasses. She walked up to one of the construction workers, pointing angrily at the barricade and shouting over the noise of the jackhammers. Even from a block away, I could see the exact moment her reality shattered. The worker pointed to the massive permanent metal signs that had just been bolted to the street poles. Historical Plaza, pedestrian traffic only. No mot vehicles past this point. Vigilators will be towed. Sarah staggered backward. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving frantically. She was probably calling Leo. She was probably calling the police. She was probably trying to find someone. Anyone who could make the noise stop and give her the street back. But the police couldn't help her. The street was legally closed by order of the city council. Sarah had to park her luxury SUV in a paid garage 3 blocks away and walk to her own restaurant in the dust. The next 4 days were a masterclass in bureaucratic panic. Through my department email, I saw the desperate inquiries flood in. Leo called the Department of Transportation. He called the mayor's office. He called the zoning board. He filed an emergency injunction with a local judge, claiming the city was illegally restricting his business access. The judge threw the injunction out within hours. The city attorneys presented the signed, certified mail receipt proving Leo had been legally notified of the rezoning months in advance. He had failed to attend the public hearing. He had waived his right to protest. The law was absolute. Friday night arrived, the night of the grand opening. It had been raining since noon. It was a cold, miserable, relentless spring downpour. I finished my shift at City Hall, put on a dark raincoat, and walked down to the new Oak Street Historical Plaza. The street was a mess. The asphalt was torn up, covered in wooden planks and orange construction, netting to allow pedestrians to walk safely over the mud. The Copper Spoon Bistro looked ridiculous. The massive front windows glowed with the warm light of the imported crystal chandeliers. I could see the pristine white tablecloths, the expensive velvet booths, and the gleaming marble bar. But the street outside looked like a war zone. Sarah had hired a private valet service for the event. The valet podium was standing uselessly on the sidewalk. The 2 valets, wearing sharp red jackets, were huddling under an umbrella, looking incredibly bored. They couldn't park any cars because no cars were allowed within a 4-block radius. I crossed the plaza and stepped into a small, quiet coffee shop directly across the street from the bistro. I ordered a tea, sat at a window table, and watched the disaster unfold. Sarah's VIP guests began to arrive around 7 o'clock. They did not look happy. These were wealthy, image-conscious people who had expected to pull their sports cars right up to the front door, hand the keys to a valet, and step directly into a luxury dining experience. Instead, they had been forced to navigate the maze of downtown one-way streets, pay $20 to park in a crowded municipal garage, and walk 4 blocks in a freezing downpour. I watched a woman in a very expensive, very ruined silk dress try to navigate the wooden construction planks in high heels. She slipped. Her partner caught her, but she stepped deeply into a puddle of muddy water. She was screaming at him. They didn't even go inside the bistro. They just turned around and walked back toward the parking garage. The guests who did make it inside were wet, cold, and absolutely furious. I watched through the glass. The restaurant was supposed to be fully booked, but at 8 o'clock prime dining time, more than half the tables were empty. I saw Sarah pacing near the host stand. She was wearing a stunning black evening gown, but her hair was frizzing from the humidity. She looked like she was on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. She kept looking out the window, staring at the empty, torn-up street, waiting for cars that were never going to come. I saw Leo standing behind the marble bar. He was drinking from a glass of whiskey. He looked pale. He looked terrified. He was finally looking at a spreadsheet in his mind, and the numbers were entirely red. He had a $400,000 loan. He had an enormous monthly overhead for staff, imported food, and expensive wine. And he had a restaurant that his target demographic physically refused to travel to. I took a slow sip of my hot tea. The warmth spread through my chest. For 12 years, I had stood in that exact building, smelling like grease, sacrificing my youth to keep the doors open. I had begged my brother to care. I had begged my father to see me. I had been kicked out into the alleyway with $20,000 and a pat on the head. They thought they could steal my foundation and build a castle on it. They didn't realize I was the one who controlled the tectonic plates. I watched Sarah argue with a wet, angry customer. I watched Leo pour another drink. I watched my family's legacy suffocate under the crushing weight of their own arrogance and a few invisible lines on a city zoning map. It was a terrible thing to witness. But, God, it was satisfying. The financial hemorrhage of a failing restaurant is not a slow leak. It is an arterial spray. In the hospitality business, your margins are razor thin on a good day. When you combine a $400,000 debt with a catastrophic drop in foot traffic, the math becomes brutal and unforgiving very quickly. The first 2 months of the Copper Spoon Bistro were a masterclass in denial. Sarah refused to accept that her luxury concept was fundamentally flawed by its location. She convinced Leo that the disastrous opening night was simply a result of bad weather and unavoidable municipal delays. She insisted that once the cobblestones were fully laid and the construction dust settled, the wealthy clientele would return. She was wrong. Wealthy people do not like to be inconvenienced. The psychological barrier of having to park 4 blocks away, walk through a public plaza, and navigate around tourists was too much for Sarah's target demographic. The people who wanted $25 avocado toast and imported Italian wine simply drove to the upscale neighborhoods on the north side of the city, where valet happily parked their sports cars right at the front door. I kept track of their downfall through a very reliable source. Maria. Maria, the head waitress Sarah had so callously fired on her first day, had quickly found a new job at a bustling diner a few miles away. But Maria still kept in touch with the kitchen staff at the bistro. The dishwashers and line cooks gossiped relentlessly, and Maria relayed every juicy detail to me over coffee on Sunday mornings. "It's ghost town in there, Maya," Maria told me one morning in late July, stirring her coffee with a grim smile. "Hector says they are doing maybe 20 covers a night, on a Friday. Can you imagine? The Oak Street Diner used to do 200 covers before noon. 20 covers won't even pay the electric bill, I noted, doing the math in my head. The massive crystal chandeliers and the heavy commercial air conditioning units were notoriously expensive to run. They are bleeding out, Maria confirmed. Hector says Leo and Sarah are screaming at each other in the back office every single day. Sarah wants to double down. She wants to hire a boutique marketing firm to relaunch the brand. She says the problem is that people don't know they are open. People know they are open, I said softly, looking out the window. They just can't get there. Exactly, Maria laughed. Leo is panicking. He missed payroll last week. He had to pay the kitchen staff out his personal savings account just to keep them from walking out mid-shift. And the bank is calling. The Small Business Administration loan was the anchor that was dragging them to the bottom of the ocean. They owed over $4,000 a month just to service the debt on the renovations. That didn't include food costs, labor, insurance, or property taxes. According to Maria's network, Leo finally broke down in August and hired a municipal lawyer. He paid a high-end downtown law firm a $5,000 retainer to investigate the Oak Street pedestrian plaza. He wanted them to find a loophole. He wanted them to file an injunction against the city to rip up the cobblestones and restore vehicular traffic. 2 days later, the lawyer called Leo with the exact information I could have given him for free. The lawyer told him that the Protected Historical Plaza designation was absolute. It was codified into the city charter. Reversing it would require a multi-year environmental impact study, a public referendum, and a supermajority vote by the city council. It would cost millions of dollars in legal fees and take half a decade to even reach the floor for a debate. The lawyer also reminded Leo, gently, that his own signature was on the certified public notice that had been mailed months before the vote. He had legally consented to his own execution. Leo was trapped in a cage of his own ignorance. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August when Leo finally came to see me. I was sitting at my desk on the 4th floor of City Hall, reviewing a zoning map for a new elementary school, when my desk phone rang. It was the security guard at the front lobby. "Ms. Maya," the guard said, "there is a man down here asking to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's an emergency. He says he's your brother." I paused. I looked at the glowing monitor. I had wondered how long it would take for his pride to break. "Tell him I will be right down," I said. I did not invite him up to my office. I did not want him in my professional space. I took the elevator down to the massive, echoing marble lobby of the municipal building. Leo was standing near the security desk. If I hadn't known it was him, I might not have recognized the man standing there. The charismatic, arrogant, golden boy was gone. He looked completely shattered. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His skin was pale and drawn tight over his cheekbones. He wasn't wearing his expensive tailored suits. He was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and slacks that looked like they hadn't been ironed in weeks. He had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. He saw me walking toward him, and he physically slumped in relief. "Maya," he said, his voice cracking. He took a step toward me, looking like he wanted to hug me. I stopped 10 feet away. I crossed my arms. "What do you want, Leo?" He dropped his arms. He looked around the busy lobby, clearly uncomfortable. "Can we go somewhere and talk? Can I buy you lunch? A coffee? Please, Maya? I really need to talk to you." "I have a meeting in 15 minutes, I lied. My schedule was completely clear for the afternoon. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here." He swallowed hard. He looked terrified. "We are going bankrupt," he whispered, the words rushing out of him like he was confessing a crime. "The restaurant, the Copper Spoon. We are losing 80% of our projected revenue. We can't make the loan payments. The bank sent a notice of default yesterday. They are threatening to foreclose on the building." I kept my face perfectly neutral. That is unfortunate. Starting a new restaurant concept is always a high-risk venture. 50% of them fail in the first year. It's not the concept, Leo pleaded, stepping closer. It's the street. The city closed the street, Maya. They put up these massive barricades. No one can park. Our customers canceled all their reservations when they realized they had to walk 4 blocks in the rain. We are totally cut off from the main traffic grid. Yes, I said calmly. The Oak Street Pedestrian Plaza. It is a very successful traffic mitigation project. The mayor is quite proud of it. Leo stared at me. His eyes were wide and frantic. Maya, you work here. You work in the planning department. You know these people. You know the director. I do. You have to help me, he begged, his voice rising slightly in the echoing lobby. A few people walking past turned to look. You have to talk to someone. Tell them it's destroying a local business. Tell them they have to open the street back up. Just for a few hours a day. Just for dinner service. Please, Maya. You can pull some strings. I looked at him, genuinely fascinated by the depth of his delusion. Pull some strings? I asked. Leo, do you honestly believe that a junior zoning analyst has the power to unilaterally overturn a unanimous city council resolution and a charter-mandated historical protection zone? You must know a loophole, he insisted, grabbing the edge of a marble pillar to steady himself. There is always a loophole. You ran the diner for 12 years. You know how this city works. I do know how this city works, I agreed. That is why I know that what you are asking is completely legally impossible. The plaza is permanent. Leo let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He leaned his head against the cold marble pillar. I'm going to lose everything, he whispered. Sarah is threatening to leave me. We spent every dime we had. We maxed out our personal credit cards to make payroll last week. The bank is going to take the building Dad paid for, I added quietly. Leo flinched as if I had struck him. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I know, he said. I know. Maya, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened after the funeral. I was grieving, Sarah was whispering in my ear. I didn't mean to cut you out like that. It was a mistake. A mistake. A mistake, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air between us. Yes, I should have let you stay on as manager. I should have listened to you about the menu. You were right. The velvet booths were a stupid idea. But we can fix it. If you just help me get the street opened back up, I'll give you your job back. I'll make you a partner. We can run it together, just like Dad wanted. I stared at the man who had shared my childhood. I stared at the man who had stood by and watched his wife fire me from my own life's work. I stared at the man who had changed the locks on the door to my second home. Leo, I said, my voice as cold and hard as the marble walls around us. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. He blinked, confused by the absolute lack of sympathy in my tone. You chose to let Sarah disrespect me, I continued, stepping closer so he could hear every word perfectly. You chose to take the equity of 12 years of my grueling labor and treat it like your own personal lottery ticket. You chose to kick me out into the alleyway with a $20,000 check and a pat on the head while you played restaurant owner with my father's legacy. Ah, Maya, please. Dad would be devastated if he knew you were letting the restaurant die. Do not talk to me about what Dad would want, I snapped, my voice finally cracking like a whip in the silent lobby. Leo physically recoiled. Dad gave you the building, he gave you the safety net. And what did you do with it? You destroyed it in less than 6 months because you are too arrogant to do the actual work. Leo's expression began to shift. The desperation slowly morphed into something darker. The panic was turning into defensive anger. It was his default mechanism when he realized he couldn't charm his way out of a consequence. You're enjoying this, Leo said, his voice dropping an octave. He narrowed his eyes at me. You like watching us fail. I am completely indifferent to your failure, I lied smoothly. I am simply explaining the reality of municipal zoning. Wait a minute, Leo said, standing up straighter. His eyes darted across my face, searching for a micro expression. You started working here right after we fired you. You work in the exact department that handles street closures." He was slow, but he wasn't completely stupid. "Did you do this?" he demanded, his voice suddenly loud enough that the security guard looked over. "Did you rezone Oak Street?" I looked at him, my expression perfectly blank. "Leo, the city council rezoned Oak Street based on a historical charter from 1985. It was a unanimous public vote." "But you submitted the proposal," he accused, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I know you did. You set us up. You closed the street on purpose to bankrupt us because you were angry about the will. If I submitted a proposal, it was part of my official duties as a city planner," I replied, my tone devoid of any emotion. "And if you had bothered to open the certified public notice that was mailed directly to your business 2 months before the vote, you could have attended the public hearing and filed a formal protest. But you didn't. You signed for the letter and threw it in the trash." Leo's jaw dropped. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He remembered the letter. He remembered throwing it away. He realized that I hadn't just beaten him. I had handed him the gun, and he had pulled the trigger himself. "You are a monster," Leo whispered, looking at me like I was a stranger. "You are deliberately destroying our family." "No," I corrected him. "I am doing my job. You are the one who destroyed the family when you changed the locks on the diner." I turned around and walked toward the elevators. "Maya," he shouted across the lobby, "if the bank takes the building, we are ruined. Sarah is going to file for divorce. I will have nothing." I pressed the elevator call button. I didn't look back. "Then I suggest you learn how to update your resume, Leo." I called out over my shoulder. "I hear the city is hiring street sweepers." The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, turned around, and watched my brother standing alone in the massive marble lobby. He looked small. He looked defeated. He looked exactly like a man who had finally run out of safety nets. The doors slid shut. The following Monday, the bank officially filed the foreclosure paperwork. The Copper Spoon Bistro was dead. But my plan was not entirely finished, because when a commercial property is foreclosed upon by a bank, it doesn't just disappear into the ether. It goes to a public municipal auction. And nobody wants to buy a foreclosed restaurant building on a street where customers cannot park. Except perhaps someone who knows exactly how to navigate the municipal bureaucracy. Someone who knows that a pedestrian plaza is the perfect location for a different kind of business. Or someone who simply wants her father's building back at a 90% discount. I sat at my desk, pulled up the city auction schedule, and began to run the numbers. The process of a commercial foreclosure is a slow, methodical, and profoundly humiliating public execution. When the bank officially took possession of the Copper Spoon Bistro, they did not just take the keys. They took the building, the land, the expensive Italian marble, the custom velvet booths, and the imported crystal chandeliers. They took everything that Leo and Sarah had bought with their massive $400,000 loan. But even with all of those luxury assets, the bank was still taking a massive loss because a commercial building is only worth what a business can generate inside of it. And thanks to the Oak Street Historical Pedestrian Plaza, no traditional high-volume retail or restaurant business wanted anything to do with 442 Oak Street. The property had effectively been branded with a scarlet letter by the local real estate community. It had negative curb appeal. It was a beautiful, historic brick box that you couldn't drive a car to. To recoup whatever fraction of their money they could, the bank put the property up for public auction on the steps of the county courthouse. I took a personal day from my job at City Hall to attend. It was a brisk Tuesday morning in October. The courthouse steps were crowded with seasoned real estate investors, men in sharp suits drinking coffee and holding clipboards. They were looking for distressed properties they could flip for a quick profit. I stood at the back of the crowd, wearing a simple wool coat, holding a cashier's check in my pocket. I had spent the last 2 months preparing for this exact moment. I had taken the $20,000 inheritance, check my father had left me, the insulting consolation prize for my 12 years of labor, and combined it with my personal savings. I had formed an anonymous limited liability company called Iron Skillet Holdings. I had worked with a small, aggressive commercial lender to secure pre-approval for a heavily discounted mortgage. The auctioneer, a loud man with a thick mustache, stepped up to the podium. He ran through a few residential foreclosures first. Then he pulled up the file for 442 Oak Street. Next item, the auctioneer barked into the microphone. Commercial building and adjacent lot, 442 Oak Street, formerly known as the Oak Street Diner, recently remodeled. A few of the investors perked up. They knew the building. It was a prime piece of historical architecture. However, the auctioneer continued, reading from the official disclosures. Buyers must be advised. The property is currently subject to a strict municipal zoning overlay. It is located within a protected historical pedestrian plaza. There is absolutely no vehicular access, no street parking, and no commercial loading zones permitted within a 4-block radius. A collective groan rippled through the crowd of investors. I watched 2 men in the front row physically cross the property off their clipboards. "We can't put a grocery store in there." One investor muttered to his partner. "We can't put a drive-through. We can't even get delivery trucks to the back door without a municipal permit." "It's a dead zone," the partner agreed, shaking his head. "The city killed it. Pass." "Bidding opens at $150,000, the auctioneer announced. The building had been valued at over $1 million just a year ago. The opening bid was an absolute insult. It was a desperate attempt by the bank to recover the baseline value of the dirt. Silence fell over the courthouse steps. The auctioneer looked around. "Do I hear 150,000? I raised my hand. "I have a bid for 150,000, the auctioneer said, pointing his pen at me. "Do I hear 160? He looked at the crowd. The men in sharp suits ignored him. They were already looking at the next page of their packets. Nobody wanted to fight the city bureaucracy. Nobody wanted to deal with the logistical nightmare of a pedestrian-only commercial property. Nobody except the city planner who had created the nightmare in the first place. "Going once," the auctioneer called out. "Going twice." "Sold." He slammed his gavel down on the podium. The sound echoed off the stone columns of the courthouse. I lowered my hand. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 6 months. I had done it. I had bought my father's building back for 15 cents on the dollar. While I was signing the final paperwork at the county clerk's office, Leo and Sarah were experiencing the final explosive stages of their financial ruin. Because the auction price of the building fell drastically short of covering their $400,000 small business administration loan, the bank invoked the personal guarantees Leo and Sarah had signed. They didn't just lose the restaurant. They lost everything. The bank seized the funds in their personal checking accounts. They initiated proceedings to repossess Sarah's luxury SUV. The financial pressure, as I knew it would, completely shattered their marriage. Maria told me the details a few days later. Sarah had packed her expensive designer bags and moved back into her parents' house in the wealthy suburbs. She had filed for divorce immediately. In her mind, she was the victim. She blamed Leo entirely. She told her friends that Leo was a failure, a terrible businessman who had ruined her life and her credit score. She never once took responsibility for the velvet booths, the imported chandeliers, or the decision to fire the loyal staff that had kept the diner afloat for a decade. She simply took what was left of her dignity and fled the sinking ship. Leo was left completely alone. He had to move out of his expensive downtown apartment and rent a tiny, depressing room in a shared house on the outskirts of the city. A week after the auction, I drove to 442 Oak Street. It was a crisp, clear autumn afternoon. The pedestrian plaza was quiet. The cobblestones looked beautiful in the sunlight, completely free of cars and traffic noise. The Copper Spoon Bistro was unlocked. The bank had hired a liquidation company to strip the interior of any remaining valuable assets. To pay down the residual debt, I walked through the front doors. The massive crystal chandeliers were already gone, leaving gaping holes in the ceiling. The velvet booths had been ripped out and stacked in the center of the room. The custom Italian marble bar top was being carefully dismantled by 3 workers in dusty overalls. It looked like the skeleton of a terrible, expensive mistake. And sitting in the middle of the wreckage, on an overturned plastic milk crate, was Leo. He was holding a clipboard, officially signing over the remaining kitchen equipment to the liquidators. He looked terrible. His hair was messy. He hadn't shaved in days. The arrogant, charming golden boy was entirely gone. He was just a tired, broken man sitting in the ruins of his father's legacy. He heard my footsteps on the hardwood floor and looked up. When he saw me, his shoulders slumped. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked exhausted. "What are you doing here, Maya?" he asked, his voice completely hollow. "Are you here to gloat? Are you here to watch the bank take the last of the stoves?" I stopped a few feet away from him. I looked around the destroyed dining room. "I'm not here to gloat, Leo," I said quietly. "I'm here to take measurements." He frowned, confused. "Measurements? What are you talking about?" "The bank owns this place now. You shouldn't even be in here without a hard hat." I reached into the pocket of my coat. I pulled out a thick, folded piece of heavy legal paper. It was the official, notarized property deed from the county clerk's office. "The bank doesn't own this place anymore," I said. I handed him the paper. Leo took it slowly. He unfolded it. His tired eyes scanned the legal text. He read the address, he read the purchase price, and then he read the name of the new legal owner, Iron Skillet Holdings, LLC. Maya, sole proprietor. Leo stopped breathing. His hands began to shake violently. The paper rattled in his grip. He looked up at me. His face was completely devoid of color. It was the look of a man who suddenly realizes he has been playing checkers, while his opponent has been playing chess with a loaded gun. "You," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You bought it." "At a 90% discount," I confirmed, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I used the $20,000 inheritance check Dad left me for the deposit." The bank was practically begging someone to take it off their hands. "But the street," Leo said, his eyes darting frantically toward the front window, looking out at the concrete barricades and the pedestrian plaza. "The street is closed. You can't run a restaurant here. There's no parking. You trapped me. You trapped yourself." I couldn't help it. A small, cold smile finally broke across my face. "Leo, you never understood urban planning. You never understood how cities actually work. You only saw what Sarah wanted to see. You saw a street closure as a death sentence for a luxury bistro." I walked over to the front window and pointed out at the wide, expansive cobblestone plaza. "A pedestrian-only street is a disaster for people who want valet parking," I explained, turning back to him. "But it is an absolute goldmine for an open-air, European-style cafe. Without cars, we can petition the city to extend our patio seating 50 feet out into the plaza. We can put 50 tables outside in the summer. We can serve cheap coffee, massive breakfasts, and craft sandwiches to the thousands of office workers who walk through this plaza every single day." Leo stared at me. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "I didn't trap myself, Leo," I said softly. "I cleared the board. I got rid of the traffic. I got rid of the debt. And, most importantly, I got rid of you." He looked down at the deed in his hands. A single tear slipped down his cheek, splashing onto the heavy paper. It wasn't a tear of anger. It was a tear of absolute, crushing defeat. He finally understood. He understood that he had underestimated me for his entire life. He understood that he had traded 12 years of my loyalty for 6 months of Sarah's vanity, and he had lost everything in the exchange. "I have to get back to work," I said, buttoning my coat. "Please make sure you leave the keys with the liquidators when you go." I turned and walked out of the building. I stepped out into the bright autumn sunlight, onto the quiet cobblestones of the pedestrian plaza. I won. I executed a flawless, legally untouchable strategy. I took back my family's legacy. 6 months later, I officially opened the Iron Skillet Cafe. I ripped out the rest of Sarah's expensive marble and brought back the retro checkered floors. I hired Maria back as the general manager, doubling her previous salary. The cafe thrived. The outdoor seating in the pedestrian plaza became a massive hit with the local office crowd. We were doing triple the volume of the old diner, with significantly lower overhead costs. I owned the building outright. I was financially secure for the rest of my life, but I want to be entirely honest about what that victory cost me. It cost me my only brother. I haven't spoken to Leo since that day in the gutted restaurant. I heard through Maria that he is working as a shift manager at a corporate chain restaurant out in the suburbs, struggling to pay off his massive personal debts. The family unit is permanently, irrevocably shattered, and it cost me the pure memory of my father. Every time I walk into the kitchen of the Iron Skillet, I don't just remember my dad teaching me how to flip pancakes. I remember the bitter realization that he thought I was strong enough to endure being robbed, while Leo was weak enough to deserve a handout. I have to live with the fact that I destroyed my father's golden boy to secure my own future. I know there are people who will say I went too far. They will say I abused my position at the city planning department. They will say I was vindictive. They will argue that I could have warned Leo about the zoning change. I could have stepped in, stopped Sarah from taking out the massive SBA loan, and saved my brother from personal bankruptcy. I could have been the bigger person. Maybe they are right. Maybe a better sister would have taken the high road and walked away with her $20,000 and her pride. But there is something I learned from sitting in those quiet, powerful municipal planning meetings. Power doesn't care about the high road. Power only respects leverage. Leo and Sarah used my father's will as leverage to kick me out of my own life. They didn't care about fairness. They didn't care about my sacrifice. They only cared about what they could legally take. So I did exactly the same thing. I just played the game at a much higher level. So I will ask you this. If you had spent 12 years of your life saving your family's business, only to be fired and replaced by a snobbish sister-in-law because of an unfair will, would you have walked away and let them enjoy the fruits of your labor? Or would you have used every weapon at your disposal, rewritten the map of the city itself, and crushed them under the weight of their own arrogance? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one.